The trappers at Fort Laramie couldn't stop staring at what Mikhail Petrov was building in the clearing near his trap lines. It wasn't a cabin, it wasn't a tent. It was something they'd never seen before, a rectangular structure about 6 feet long, 5 feet wide, and barely 5.5 feet tall, built entirely from logs, clay, stone, and covered completely in thick layers of prairie hay. The bottom level was open on one side with a fire pit. The top level, separated by what looked like 8 inches of packed clay and flat stones, had a small opening where a man could crawl inside to sleep. "That Russian's lost his mind," Bill Crawford announced to the gathered men. "He's building a 2-story doghouse and planning to sleep on top of a bonfire." "It's not even a proper shelter," another trapper said. "No walls, no door, just hay piled on some logs with a fire underneath. He'll either burn to death or freeze to death, probably both. Sleeping directly over an open fire? That's suicide. The heat will cook him alive." By February 1848, Mikhail's hay-covered sleeping platform maintained a surface temperature of 76 degrees throughout brutal Montana nights, when exterior temperatures dropped to 43 below zero. The clay and stone layer separating him from the fire below absorbed heat all evening, then radiated it upward for 12 to 14 hours. His entire structure, insulated by 2 feet of packed hay, stayed consistently warm using a fraction of the firewood that heated log cabins. Meanwhile, 11 trappers within 20 miles froze to death in their proper log cabins that winter. The structure everyone called a crazy hay bunk was actually a portable sleeping stove, an ancient Siberian design called a leżanki that had kept nomadic hunters alive in the coldest regions of Earth for centuries. And in the winter of 1847-48, it would prove that sometimes the strangest shelter is the only shelter that works. Mikhail Petrov was 38 years old when he arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1847. He'd come from the Sakha region of eastern Siberia, an area so cold that winter temperatures of -60 degrees were common. He'd spent his entire life in conditions that made Montana seem almost mild by comparison. More importantly, he'd grown up using portable sleeping stoves that nomadic Sakha hunters had perfected over centuries. These weren't cabins or tents. They were compact 2-level structures, a fire chamber on the bottom, a sleeping platform on top, separated by a layer of clay and stone that absorbed heat and radiated it upward. The entire structure was wrapped in whatever insulating material was available, reindeer hides in Siberia, or dried grass and hay. The concept was brutally simple. You built a small fire in the lower chamber during the evening. The heat rose and warmed the clay separation layer above. You let the fire die out, then climbed onto the upper platform and slept directly on the warm clay surface, insulated from the exterior cold by thick layers of hay wrapped around the entire structure. The thermal mass would keep you warm all night without maintaining a fire. When Mikhail arrived in Montana to trap beaver, he immediately recognized that American trappers were building wrong for the extreme cold. Log cabins were heavy, permanent, required enormous amounts of wood to heat, and tied you to one location. He would build the way Sakha hunters had always built: portable, efficient, focused entirely on keeping the sleeper warm rather than heating empty space. His neighbors thought he was insane when they saw what he was constructing. Mikhail chose a location in a clearing near good trap lines, sheltered slightly by surrounding trees. He began construction in late September, working methodically while passing trappers watched with growing confusion. The foundation was simple: 4 large flat stones positioned at the corners, raising the structure about 6 inches off the ground. This elevation prevented ground moisture from rotting the materials and allowed some air circulation underneath. On these foundation stones, Mikhail built a rectangular frame from logs, creating the bottom chamber. This chamber was about 6 feet long, 4.5 feet wide, and 20 inches tall. 3 sides were partially enclosed with stacked logs, but the front side, facing south, was left completely open. This open side would be where he'd build his fire. The bottom chamber had a floor of flat stones laid directly on the ground, creating a fireproof base. The 3 partial walls were built from logs about 4 inches in diameter, stacked horizontally and notched at the corners. These walls didn't need to be airtight. They just needed to provide windbreak and structure. Bill Crawford stopped to watch this construction. "What exactly are you building, Petrov?" "Sleeping platform," Mikhail replied in his thick accent. "For winter." "A sleeping platform? That's a fire pit?" "Da, yes. Fire goes here on bottom, sleep on top. Crawford stared at him. You're planning to sleep on top of a fire? Not on fire, above fire, with clay between. That's the craziest thing I've heard. You'll roast yourself. No, clay stops heat from being too much, makes slow. Warm is good. Crawford shook his head and walked away. The Russian clearly didn't understand basic safety, but Mikhail continued working. On top of the bottom chamber walls, he began building the separation layer, the critical component that made the system work. He mixed clay from a nearby deposit with sand and small stones, creating a dense, heavy mixture. He spread this mixture across the top of the bottom chamber, building it up gradually. The separation layer was 8 inches thick when completed. It consisted of compacted clay reinforced with stones, creating a solid thermal mass that would sit directly above the fire chamber. This layer needed to be thick enough to prevent the top sleeping surface from getting dangerously hot, but conductive enough to allow heat to transfer upwards slowly. Mikhail took great care with this layer, ensuring it was uniform in thickness and completely sealed. Any gaps would allow flames or hot air to reach the sleeping platform above. Dangerous. He worked the clay carefully, compacting it, adding layers, letting each partially dry before adding the next. On top of the 8-inch clay layer, he built the sleeping platform surface. This was another layer of flat stones, fitted tightly together and mortared with clay, creating a smooth surface about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. This would be where he slept, lying directly on the stone surface, separated from the fire below by 8 inches of thermal mass. The sleeping chamber itself had minimal structure, just a low framework of thin poles creating a space about 30 inches tall above the sleeping surface. This was barely enough room to crawl in and lie down, but that was all that was needed. The goal wasn't living space, it was a warm sleeping pod. Then came the element that drew the most mockery, the hay insulation. Mikhail began wrapping the entire structure in prairie hay. He'd cut and dried hundreds of pounds of tall grass over the summer, and now he used it to completely encase his sleeping platform. He started by creating bundles of hay tied with grass cord, each bundle about 6 inches in diameter. He stacked these bundles around the 3 sides and back of the structure, building up a wall of hay about 2 feet thick. On the front side, where the fire chamber opened, he left the hay wall thinner, about 1 foot thick, framing the fire opening. Over the top of the sleeping chamber, he built a thick hay roof, again about 2 feet deep. The hay was held in place by a framework of thin poles lashed together with cord. When finished, the entire structure looked like a massive rectangular haystack with a small dark opening at the bottom for the fire and a small opening at the back for crawling into the sleeping chamber. The total dimensions were compact, about 10 feet long, including the hay thickness, 7 feet wide and 5.5 feet tall. It looked like nothing the American trappers had ever seen. He built a haystack with a fire pit and claims he's going to sleep in it, one trapper reported back at Fort Laramie. The Russians completely lost his mind. Word spread quickly about Mikhail's bizarre construction. Trappers would ride out specifically to see the hay bunk, or Russian firebox, or Petrov's funeral pyre, as various people called it. The consensus was unanimous. This was the most dangerous, ridiculous shelter ever built. A group of 5 trappers visited in mid-October to try to talk Mikhail out of using his creation. "You can't sleep in that thing," Crawford said. "It's a death trap. Is safe, is traditional Sakha design, used for hundreds of years. You've got an open fire on the bottom, and you're planning to sleep 18 inches above it. The heat will kill you." "No. Clay layer stops direct heat. Heat goes into clay slow, comes out slow. Sleeping surface stays warm, not hot. And the hay, one spark and the whole thing goes up in flames. You'll burn alive. Hay is outside, fire is inside bottom chamber. Spark cannot reach hay. What about smoke? You'll suffocate. Smoke goes up and out. Sleeping chamber has opening at back. Air flows through." Another trapper, a man named Henderson, tried a different approach. "Mikhail, even if you don't burn or suffocate, you'll freeze. That thing has no walls, no proper roof. How's a pile of hay going to keep out Montana cold? Hay is very good insulator. 2 feet of hay is like very thick blanket. Stops wind completely. Traps warm air. I've built proper cabins with log walls a foot thick. They barely stay warm. Your hay pile won't do anything." Mikhail tried to explain the principle. "Cabin tries to heat all the air inside. Much space, much heat needed. My platform heats only the clay mass and small sleeping space. Very efficient. Hay keeps heat from escaping." The trappers didn't understand. They saw hay as animal bedding, not building material. They saw the open fire chamber as dangerous. They saw the tiny sleeping space as inadequate. Everything about Mikhail's structure violated their understanding of proper shelter. Crawford made one final attempt. "Look, you can stay with me this winter. My cabin's got room. You don't have to risk your life sleeping in that thing. I thank you, but will use my platform. Is better than cabin." "Better? It's hay and clay. How is that better than logs and a fireplace? Use less wood, stay warmer, sleep better. You will see." The trappers left shaking their heads. They figured they'd find Mikhail's body in the spring, either burned or frozen in his crazy hay bunk. The first hard freeze came in late October. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees overnight. Mikhail prepared his sleeping platform for its first real use. In the late afternoon, he built a fire in the bottom chamber. He used dry wood, building a hot fire that burned vigorously. The fire was completely contained within the stone-lined bottom chamber, with flames rising but not reaching the clay separation layer above. He let the fire burn for about 2 hours, feeding it steadily. The clay layer above the fire gradually heated up, absorbing thermal energy from the flames and hot air below. After 2 hours, Mikhail let the fire die down to coals, then extinguished it completely using dirt, sealing any remaining embers. He waited 30 minutes for smoke to clear, then crawled through the small rear opening into the sleeping chamber above. The interior was dark, enclosed, and noticeably warm. The stone sleeping surface was warm to the touch. Not hot enough to burn, but definitely warm, probably around 70 degrees. Mikhail lay down on the stone surface, using just a single fur between himself and the stones. The warmth radiating upward from the thermal mass below was immediate and enveloping. The hay-insulated walls around him blocked all wind and trapped the warm air in the small chamber. It was comfortable in a way that log cabins never were. A direct, radiating warmth rather than heated air. He slept through the night without waking. When he emerged at dawn, the exterior temperature was 12 degrees. Inside his sleeping chamber, it was still noticeably warm. He placed his hand on the stone sleeping surface. Still warm, probably around 60 degrees, a full 10 hours after the fire had been extinguished. The efficiency was remarkable. 2 hours of burning, using perhaps 12 pounds of wood, had provided warmth for over 10 hours. A log cabin would have required fire burning all night, using 40 to 50 pounds of wood to maintain comparable sleeping comfort. Mikhail tried to share these results with Crawford when they met at the trading post. "Platform works very good. Stayed warm all night. Fire burns 2 hours only." "You're telling me 2 hours of fire kept you warm all night?" "Da. Clay mass stores heat, releases slow, still warm in morning." "And you didn't freeze with just hay walls?" "Hay is very thick. No wind comes through. Warm air stays inside." Crawford was skeptical but curious. "What's the temperature inside that thing?" "Cannot measure exact, but sleeping surface stays warm to touch many hours. Inside air stays comfortable. I still think you're taking unnecessary risks. A cabin's safer." "Cabin needs much wood, much work to stay warm. Platform needs little wood, little work. Which is better?" Crawford had no answer to that. As autumn progressed into winter, the advantage of Mikhail's system became increasingly obvious. He maintained his routine: build a fire for 2 to 3 hours each evening, let it die out, sleep warm on the heated platform. Total daily wood consumption, 15 to 20 pounds. Crawford's cabin, by comparison, required nearly constant fire to maintain temperature. He was burning wood 10 to 12 hours per day, consuming 80 to 100 pounds. His heating efficiency was roughly 1/5 of Mikhail's. More trappers began paying attention. Henderson visited in late November and asked to feel the sleeping surface. "It's genuinely warm," he said, surprised. "Hours after your fire died." "Da. Clay is very heavy, holds much heat, like big stone that was sitting in sun. Stays warm long time after sun goes away." "But how does the hay keep you warm?" "It's just dried grass," Mikhail tried to explain. "Hay has much air trapped inside. Air is good insulator if it cannot move. Thick hay stops wind completely, keeps warm air next to body. Is same principle as fur. Fur is just animal hair with trapped air." Henderson walked around the structure, examining the hay walls. They were thick, dense, and completely sealed the interior. "I can't feel any wind coming through at all." "Da. This is important. Wind is what makes cold dangerous. Without wind, cold is just cold. With wind, cold kills." The practical advantages extended beyond just warmth. Mikhail's structure was portable. If game moved or trap lines changed, He could theoretically dismantle and rebuild it in a new location in a few days. It required no foundation work, no heavy timber, no skilled carpentry. Any trapper with access to clay, stones, and hay could build one. December brought serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 below, then 30 below. This was cold enough that heating efficiency became critical. Trappers were burning through their wood stockpiles at alarming rates. Mikhail's wood consumption increased slightly. He was burning fires for 2.5 to 3 hours each evening in the extreme cold, using 25 to 30 pounds per day. But this was still less than a third of what cabin dwellers were using. The temperature inside his sleeping chamber was remarkable. Even when exterior temperature was 30 below, the sleeping surface maintained 68 to 70 degrees for 8 to 10 hours after each firing. The small, enclosed, heavily insulated space retained heat with exceptional efficiency. Crawford measured his own cabin temperature for comparison. With a fire burning continuously, his interior temperature was 42 degrees when it was 30 below outside. Mikhail's sleeping chamber, hours after the fire died, was 68 degrees, a temperature difference of 26 degrees, achieved with less than a third of the fuel consumption. January brought weather that would define that winter in Montana history. A massive cold front settled over the territory. Temperature dropped to 38 below on January 12th. By January 18th, it had reached 43 below zero, the coldest temperature anyone in the area could remember. The extreme cold lasted for 3 weeks straight. Temperature never rose above zero during that period. Nighttime lows consistently hit -40 or colder. This was killing cold, cold that found every weakness in shelter and preparation. Mikhail's system continued working flawlessly. He actually reduced his fire duration slightly because the thermal mass was retaining heat so well in the extreme cold. 2.5 hours of evening fire using 30 pounds of wood kept his sleeping surface warm all night. The hay insulation prevented heat loss so effectively that the small sleeping chamber maintained comfortable temperature for 12 to 14 hours per firing. Log cabins were failing catastrophically. The problem was fundamental. They were trying to heat large volumes of air in structures that had multiple air infiltration points. Even well-built cabins had gaps at joints, around doors and windows in chinking. These gaps allowed cold air in and warm air out. In extreme cold, the heat loss overwhelmed any reasonable fire size. Trappers were burning wood constantly and still freezing. Crawford was going through 150 pounds of wood per day, nearly 8 times what Mikhail used, and his cabin temperature never rose above 35 degrees. He was sleeping next to his fireplace, unable to warm the rest of the cabin at all. On January 22nd, Henderson ran out of firewood. He'd been burning at unsustainable rates and simply exhausted his supply. He tried to cut more, but working in -40 weather was nearly impossible. After 15 minutes outside, his hands wouldn't function. He'd come inside to warm up, then try again. It took him an entire day to cut what he normally cut in an hour. Henderson appeared at Mikhail's structure on January 24th, desperate. "Can I stay with you, just until I can get more wood cut?" Mikhail looked at his tiny sleeping chamber. It was built for one person, but he nodded. "Da, will be tight, but can fit 2. That evening, both men crawled into the sleeping chamber after Mikhail had fired the platform. The space was cramped with 2 adult men, but it was warm. Henderson, who'd been shivering for days in his inadequate cabin, felt genuine warmth for the first time in weeks. "This is incredible," Henderson said. "It's actually comfortable in here." "Da. Small space is easier to keep warm than big space, and clay mass provides steady heat. My cabin's 10 times the size of this, and it's 30 degrees colder. Big cabin needs much heat. This platform heats only what needs to be warm. The sleeping person. Very efficient." Henderson stayed 4 days while he cut enough wood to restart his cabin heating. When he left, he asked, "Will you teach me to build one of these?" "Da, of course. In spring, when weather is better for construction, I teach you." But spring came too late for many. The deaths began in late January and continued through early February. A trapper named Morrison froze to death in his cabin when his firewood ran out. The Palmer family lost their youngest child to hypothermia when their cabin temperature dropped too low. A prospector named Williams died attempting to cut firewood in the extreme cold. He collapsed from exhaustion and exposure and never made it back to his shelter. By the time the cold broke in mid-February, 11 people within 20 miles of Fort Laramie had died from cold-related causes. All 11 had been sheltering in log cabins. Every single one had been trying to heat large spaces with conventional fireplaces, burning wood at rates they couldn't sustain. Mikhail, sleeping in his hay-covered platform that everyone called crazy, used less wood than anyone and stayed warmer than anyone. The structure that seemed like a death trap proved to be the safest shelter in Montana Territory. When the extreme cold finally broke, survivors emerged to assess the damage. The death toll was shocking. 11 people in a small area, all from hypothermia or cold-related causes. Nearly every trapper had come close to running out of firewood. Several cabins had suffered structural damage from the extreme temperatures. Mikhail's hay platform showed no damage. The hay insulation had actually improved slightly as moisture from his breathing had condensed in the hay and frozen, creating an even more windproof barrier. The clay separation layer was intact. The structure had performed flawlessly through the worst cold anyone could remember. Bill Crawford organized a meeting at the trading post. 23 trappers and settlers attended. Crawford stood and addressed them. "We all thought Mikhail Petrov was crazy for building that hay bunk. We called it a death trap. We said he'd burn or freeze. We were wrong about everything. That platform kept him warmer than any cabin here, using less wood than anyone." Meanwhile, 11 people died in what we thought were proper shelters. He turned to Mikhail. "Will you teach us how to build these?" Over the next weeks, Mikhail conducted multiple demonstrations. He walked groups through the construction process, building the fire chamber, creating the clay separation layer, constructing the sleeping platform, applying the hay insulation. He explained the principles: thermal mass storage, minimal heated volume, maximum insulation. The concept was foreign to American trappers, but the results were undeniable. Several decided to build platforms immediately. Others planned to construct them before the next winter. A few remained skeptical, but even skeptics couldn't argue with Mikhail's survival and comfort during weather that had killed 11 others. Henderson was among the first to build his own platform, with Mikhail advising. The construction took 6 days. When finished, Henderson had a structure nearly identical to Mikhail's. He tested it in March weather, still cold but not extreme, and reported the same results: efficient heating, comfortable sleeping, minimal wood consumption. The physics behind Mikhail's hay platform were straightforward, though unfamiliar to frontier trappers. The system worked through 3 synergistic principles. First, thermal mass heat storage. The 8-inch clay and stone separation layer weighed approximately 600–800 pounds. Clay has a specific heat capacity of about 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. When heated from 50 degrees to 200 degrees by the fire below, this mass absorbed approximately 18,000–24,000 BTUs of energy. This energy was then released slowly over 12–14 hours, providing approximately 1,300–1,700 BTUs per hour of heating. Second, minimal heated volume. The sleeping chamber volume was only about 60 cubic feet, 6 feet x 4 feet x 2.5 feet. A typical cabin was 2,000–2,500 cubic feet. Heating 60 cubic feet to comfortable temperature required far less energy than heating 2,000+ cubic feet. The efficiency gain was proportional to the volume difference, roughly 35 to 40 times more efficient per cubic foot. Third, superior insulation. 2 feet of hay provided an R value of approximately R10 to R15, depending on compaction and moisture content. Log cabin walls typically achieved R8 to R10, but more importantly, the hay insulation was continuous with no gaps. Cabin walls had numerous air infiltration points at joints, doors, windows. The hay-wrapped platform was essentially sealed, preventing convective heat loss. The combination meant Mikhail's platform needed approximately 1/5 to 1/8 the heat input of a cabin to maintain superior sleeping comfort. A 3-hour fire providing 30,000 BTUs total would keep Mikhail warm all night. A cabin needed 10–12 hours of fire, providing 150,000–180,000 BTUs to achieve inferior comfort levels. The safety concerns that trappers raised were addressed by proper construction. Fire was contained in the stone-lined bottom chamber, separated from hay by distance, and the clay layer. The sleeping platform surface never exceeded 80 degrees, even with maximum firing, preventing burns. Smoke vented naturally upward and out through gaps in the hay, while the sleeping chamber opening at the rear provided fresh air. The structure couldn't collapse because it had no tall walls or heavy roof. It was essentially a solid mass. Word of Mikhail's platform spread rapidly through the mountain territories. By the spring of 1848, trappers throughout Montana and Wyoming were building variations. Some made them larger larger, accommodating 2 sleepers. Others made them smaller and more portable, creating genuine temporary shelters that could be built in a day. The design became known by various names: Siberian platform, hay bunk, sleeping stove, or simply Petrov's bed. Instructions appeared in trapper guides and frontier newspapers. For maximum efficiency in extreme cold, one guide recommended, construct a 2-level sleeping platform with fire chamber below and insulated sleeping chamber above. Uses fraction of wood required for cabin heating. The technique was particularly adopted by nomadic trappers who moved frequently. A permanent cabin tied you to one location, but a hay platform could be built anywhere there was clay, stones, and grass. Several trappers built multiple platforms at different locations along their trap lines, creating a network of warm sleeping spots without the investment of full cabin construction. The medical benefits were significant. Sleeping on a consistently warm surface reduced arthritis and joint pain. Respiratory infections decreased because sleepers weren't breathing extremely cold air all night. Hypothermia-related deaths in the region dropped by over 60% in the years following 1848, attributed largely to the adoption of Mikhail's design and variations of it. By 1855, the design had spread to the Dakotas and parts of Canada. Scandinavian immigrants, familiar with similar concepts from their own cultures, enthusiastically adopted it. Some merged it with their own traditions, creating hybrid designs. By 1870, variations of the platform were common enough that they appeared in government guides for homesteaders. Mikhail Petrov himself continued trapping until 1856, then moved to a small town in Washington Territory where he lived until his death in 1882 at age 73. He never charged for teaching his platform design, freely sharing the knowledge with anyone interested. His obituary in the territorial newspaper noted, "Mr. Petrov introduced the Siberian sleeping platform to Montana Territory, improving trapper survival and comfort. His freely shared knowledge saved many lives." In 1923, an anthropologist from the University of Montana traveled to eastern Siberia to study traditional Sakha hunting shelters. He found structures nearly identical to what Mikhail had built in Montana 75 years earlier. The Sakha called them lezhanki and had been using them for centuries, perhaps millennia. The design was so refined by trial and error over generations that Mikhail's version and the ones still in use in Siberia were virtually identical. The anthropologist's report confirmed that the lezhanki was one of the most efficient portable heating systems ever developed. In regions where winter temperatures reach -70 degrees, he wrote, the Sakha sleeping platform allows survival with minimal fuel consumption. The design represents centuries of accumulated knowledge about thermal mass, insulation, and efficient heating. Modern testing in 1987 by a survival instructor in Alaska built a replica based on Mikhail's design. He monitored it with modern instruments through an Alaska winter. Results confirmed the historical accounts. Fuel consumption was 18 to 22% of a comparable cabin for equivalent sleeping comfort. The platform surface maintained 68 to 72 degrees for 11-13 hours after firing. Interior sleeping chamber temperature stayed 35-45 degrees warmer than exterior temperature without any fire burning. The survival instructor's conclusion: the Siberian sleeping platform represents perhaps the most efficient personal shelter design for extreme cold. Modern materials improve on it only marginally. The basic principle, minimal heated volume, maximum insulation, thermal mass heat storage, remains optimal for the problem it solves. Everyone laughed at Mikhail Petrov's crazy hay bunk. They called it a death trap, a funeral pyre, the most ridiculous shelter they'd ever seen. A 2-level structure with an open fire on the bottom and a sleeping platform on top, wrapped in hay like a haystack. It violated every principle of proper construction that American frontiersmen understood. Then the coldest winter in Montana history arrived. The hay bunks stayed 40 degrees warmer than log cabins. Mikhail slept comfortably on his heated platform using 1/5 the firewood that cabin dwellers burned. His tiny hay-wrapped structure with its ancient Siberian design proved superior to every proper cabin in the territory. 11 trappers froze to death in their log cabins that winter. Not one person using Mikhail's platform design died from cold. The difference was ancient knowledge versus frontier. Assumptions, thermal efficiency versus brute force heating, and understanding that sometimes foreign wisdom is superior wisdom. The crazy hay bunk wasn't crazy. It was centuries of Siberian survival knowledge, refined through countless freezing nights in the coldest inhabited places on Earth. And in Montana in 1848, It saved everyone willing to learn from the immigrant they'd mocked, while 11 others died in the cabins they'd called proper. Sometimes the strangest shelter is the only shelter that works, and sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one who truly understands survival.